This is a film about one very simple question. How did we get here? These are the elements and compounds from which all humans are made. They're incredibly, almost embarrassingly common. In fact, almost 99% of the human body is a mixture of air, water, coal, and chalk, with traces of other slightly more exotic elements like iron, zinc, phosphorus, and sulfur.
In fact, I've estimated that the elements which make up the average human cost at most a few pounds. But somehow, trillions of these very ordinary atoms conspire miraculously to organize themselves into thinking, breathing, living human beings. How the wonders of creation are assembled from such simple building blocks is surely the most intriguing question we can ask.
You may think that answering it is beyond the realm of science, but that's changing. For the first time, I believe, science has pushed past religion and philosophy in daring to tackle this most fundamental of questions.
This film is the story of a series of bizarre and interconnected discoveries that revealed a hidden face of nature, that woven into its simplest and most basic laws is a power to be unpredictable. It's about how inanimate matter with no purpose or design can spontaneously create exquisite beauty. It's about how the same laws that make the universe chaotic and unpredictable can turn simple dust into human beings. It's about the discovery that there is a strange and unexpected relationship between order and chaos. The natural world really is one great, blooming, buzzing confusion. It's a mess of quirky shapes and blotches. What patterns there are never quite regular and never seem to repeat exactly. The idea that all this mayhem, all this chaos, is underpinned, indeed determined, by mathematical rules, and that we can work out what those rules might be, runs counter to our most dearly held intuitions. So not surprisingly, the first man to really take on the momentous task of unraveling nature's mysterious mathematics had a very special and unusual mind. He was both a great scientist and a tragic hero. He was born in 1912 in London. His name was Alan Turing.
Alan Turing was a remarkable man, one of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived. He discovered many of the fundamental ideas that underpin the modern computer. Also, during the Second World War, he worked here at Bletchley Park, just outside today's Milton Keynes, in what was then a secret government project called Station X, which was set up to crack the German military codes.
The Station X codebreakers proved highly effective, and Turing's contribution was crucial. The work he personally did to crack German naval codes saved thousands of Allied lives and was a turning point in the war.
But code breaking was just one aspect of Turing's genius, just one part of his uncanny ability to see patterns that are hidden from the rest of us. For Turing, the natural world offered up the ultimate codes, and over the course of his life, he'd come tantalizingly close to cracking them.
Turing was a very original person, And he had realised that there was this possibility that simple mathematical equations might describe aspects of the biological world, and no one had thought of that before.
Of all nature's mysteries, the one that fascinated Turing most was the idea that there might be a mathematical basis to human intelligence. Turing had very personal reasons for believing in this.
It was the death of this young man, Christopher Morcom, who Alan Turing, well, he was gay and it'd been a great emotional thing of his life at that point. Christopher Morcom suddenly died. And Alan Turing was obviously he was very emotionally disturbed by this, but you can see that he wanted to put this in an intellectual context, a scientific context. And the question he wanted to put into context was, what happens to the mind? What happens to it? What is it?
Turing became convinced that mathematics could be used to describe biological systems and ultimately intelligence. This fascination would give rise to the modern computer, and later in Turing's life, an even more radical idea. The idea that a simple mathematical description could be given for a mysterious process that takes place in an embryo. The process is called morphogenesis, and it's very puzzling. At first, all the cells in the embryo are identical. Then, the cells begin to clump together and also become different from each other. How does this happen? With no thought, no central coordination. How do cells that start off identical know to become, say, skin, while others become part of an eye? Morphogenesis is a spectacular example of something called self-organization. And before Turing, no one had a clue how it worked. Then, in 1952, Turing published this, his paper with the world's first mathematical explanation for morphogenesis. The sheer chutzpah of this paper was staggering. In it, Turing used a mathematical equation of the kind normally seen in papers on astronomy or atomic physics to describe a living process. No one had done anything like this. Crucially, Turing's equations did, for the first time, describe how a biological system could self-organize. They showed that something smooth and featureless can develop features.
One of the astonishing things about Turing's work was that, starting with a description of really very simple processes that were governed by very simple equations, by putting these together, suddenly complexity emerged. The pattern suddenly came out as a natural consequence. And I think in many ways this was very, very unexpected.
In essence, Turing's equations described something quite familiar, but which no one had thought of in the context of biology before. Think of the way a steady wind blowing across sand creates all kinds of shapes. The grains self-organize into ripples, waves, and dunes. This happens even though the grains are virtually identical and have no knowledge of the shapes they become part of. Turing argued that in a very similar way, chemicals seeping across an embryo might cause its cells to self-organize into different organs. These are Turing's own very rough scribblings of how this might work. They show how a completely featureless chemical soup can evolve these strange blobs and patches. In his paper, he refined his sketches to show how his equations could spontaneously create markings similar to those on the skins of animals.
Turing went around showing people pictures saying, doesn't this look a bit like the patterns on a cow? And everyone sort of, what is this man on about? But actually, he knew what he was doing. Because, yeah, indeed, they did look like the patterns on a cow, and that's one of the reasons why cows have this sort of dappled pattern or whatever. So, an area where mathematics had never been used before, pattern formation in biology, animal markings, suddenly the door was opened and we could see that mathematics might be useful in that sort of area. So even though Turing's exact equations are not the full story, they are the first piece of mathematical work that showed there was any possibility of doing this kind of thing.
Of course, we now know that morphogenesis is much more complicated than the process Turing's equations describe. In fact, the precise mechanism of how DNA molecules in our cells interact with other chemicals is still fiercely debated by scientists. But Turing's idea that whatever is going on is deep down a simple mathematical process was truly revolutionary.
Well, I think Alan Turing's paper is probably the cornerstone in the whole idea of how morphogenesis works. What it does is it provides us with a mechanism, something that Darwin didn't, for how pattern emerges. Darwin, of course, tells us that once you have a pattern and it is coded for in the genes, that may or may not be passed on depending on circumstances. But what it doesn't do is explain where that pattern comes from in the first place. That's the real mystery. And so what Turing had done was to suddenly provide an accessible chemical mechanism for doing this. That was amazing.
Turing was onto a really big, bold idea. But sadly, we can only speculate how his extraordinary mind would have developed his idea. Because shortly after his groundbreaking paper on morphogenesis, a dreadful and completely avoidable tragedy destroyed his life.
After his work breaking codes at Bletchley Park, you might well have assumed that Turing would have been honoured by the country he did so much to protect. This couldn't be further from the truth. What happened to him after the war was a great tragedy, and one of the most shameful episodes in the history of British science.
The same year Turing published his morphogenesis paper, he had a brief affair with a man called Arnold Murray. The affair went sour, and Murray was involved in a burglary at Turing's house. But when Turing reported this to the police, they arrested him as well as Murray. In court, the prosecution then argued that Turing, with his university education, had led Murray astray. He was convicted of gross indecency. The judge then offered Turing a dreadful choice.
He could either go to prison or sign up to a regime of female hormone injections to cure him of his homosexuality. He chose the latter, and it was to send him into a spiral of depression. On the 8th of June 1954, Turing's body was found by his cleaner. He died the day before by taking a bite from an apple he'd laced with cyanide, ending his own life.
Alan Turing died aged just 41. The loss to science is incalculable. Turing would never know that his ideas would inspire an entirely new mathematical approach to biology, and that scientists would find equations like his really do explain many of the shapes that appear on living organisms. Looking back, we now know Turing had really grasped the idea that the wonders of creation are derived from the simplest of rules. He had, perhaps unexpectedly, taken the first step to a new kind of science. The next step in this story was just as unexpected, and in many ways just as tragic as Turing's.